Mr. Jonathan Williams, a good friend with ALEC's American Legislative Exchange Council. Sorry about that. We're probably going to need you to fill out a card at some point, but don't worry about it now. But why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll get going.
Well, thank you, Leader Wright, and thank you, members of the committee. And I commend you for taking on this really extraordinary opportunity to make Louisiana more competitive through tax reform and through other public policy changes. And by background, I serve as Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy at ALEC in Arlington, Virginia. But for the last 20 years, I've traveled the 50 states multiple times over, working with legislators like you to make their states more competitive through policy that's principled, that has taxpayer focus at heart. And so today, per your request, I'd like to just give a summary of what's going on across the country on a broad landscape, and happy to take questions, I know, in the time that we have available. But one of the things I'll be drawing on is the annual Rich States, Poor States report that I co-author with Dr. Arthur Laffer, a Reagan economist and longtime economic leader in the field of tax policy and incentives and overall fiscal health of states, and also economist Stephen Moore. And so we'll be walking through what we've seen nationally, as well as some of the implications for Louisiana moving forward. And for some of you that may not be as familiar with ALEC, we are the nation's largest nonpartisan voluntary membership organization of state legislators and dedicated to the principles of limited responsible government, free markets, and federalism. Comprised of nearly a quarter of all state legislators across the country. And it's an incredible opportunity to be here today to share our nonpartisan research and analysis. And one thing...
Real quick, if I don't mind, maybe a little quick commercial for those who aren't as familiar. This is Rich States, Poor States. I've read it every year, been in the legislature. It's an annual publication. It's a great way to compare Louisiana versus other states in a very systematic way. So just in case anybody missed that, I'm sure we can get them copies at some point. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Leader Wright. And I will say, and you'll find as you study Rich States, Poor States, as we'll get into some of the rankings a little bit later, as you'll hear from my friends at the Tax Foundation, as you hear from other groups that come up with these national type landscape rankings of economic outlook or tax competitiveness, I think it won't be a surprise to members of the committee that you probably don't like how you rank in many of the ways that groups rank Louisiana today. And I know that part of this process, or the important process of kicking off the debate right now, is how to change that, and how to have upward mobility for all taxpayers here in Louisiana, and how to make Louisiana, once again, a haven for job creation and for inbound migration. That's one of the biggest things that I'm going to be talking about, is the linkage between healthy economies and lower taxes and in-migration into states. That's a key element of taxpayers that vote with their feet, and as it turns out, based on the evidence, they're voting very strongly against the states with high tax rates and towards the states that avoid income taxes or have lower taxes altogether. But the one thing that I think is an important thing to start with, and it's always why before we get to the tax policy portion of this discussion, is tax policy and spending policy are two sides of the same fiscal coin. And getting it right on spending is essential, I think, for getting it right on taxes. And that's why this is the predicate for good tax policy long term. And the problem, as I outlined here, is not a problem that's unique to Louisiana by any stretch of the imagination. States across the country have spent far too quickly in many cases. As you know, we're sitting recently at nearly 50-year historic surplus highs for many states across the country when you look at it in aggregate. And of course, we've seen these just a ton of new federal support going to states and local units of government coming from the federal government. And we can have the discussion whether that's sustainable or not. I tend to think in an era of $35 trillion of national debt that is not sustainable, and we should not count on that federal support remaining at the levels that it's been in recent years. But obviously an important element as we're talking about the budget picture for states like Louisiana. And as I outlined the problem, it is not just Louisiana, but it is states that take last year's budget and just automatically then discuss the merits of increasing spending by X percent versus Y percent, instead of taking a more holistic look at budgeting in general. And that's the approach that ALEC has often talked about for years. And I think there's a great bipartisan success record for states states that have more of a priority-based budgeting approach versus just a budgeting as usual approach, taking last year's budget and then arguing about whether it should be a 5% or a 10% growth budget. And so one of the things we point to is what Washington State did under a Democrat governor and under a bipartisan group of legislators that they called it priorities of government, to start to look under the hood in spending decisions to say, why is it we do the things that we do as state government, and what are the goals that we want to achieve, and making sure those spending priorities are aligned with the goals and the outcomes that we'd like to achieve. And just briefly, I'll just go through 5 of, I think, the important budget and spending area questions that govern really this Washington State process that I think are good best practices for states to consider before you get to the tax policy side is, first of all, what is the role of government? What essential services government must provide to fulfill its purpose? How do we know if government's doing a good job? What should all of it cost? And then when cuts must be made, how will they be properly prioritized? Those, I think, are really essential questions to getting the budget side of this equation correctly. And when you get the budget side of the equation correctly, you can get the tax side of the equation correctly that much easier, and you can go that much further. Because as we're going to talk about in a moment, we've seen a tax cut revolution sweep America in the last several years coming out of the pandemic and the government-ordered lockdowns. And it's a huge opportunity for states that are using these surplus dollars and getting it right in many cases. And it's also potentially a major problem for states, because states can fall behind by standing still with so many states moving in the right direction. I think that's one of the key points I'd like to hit on. When it comes to our view of tax policy, and obviously there's lots of different ways to analyze tax policy, but we look at tax policy within this frame, really the framework that we've developed at ALEC in our Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force. And that is, taxes should be simple, they should be transparent, they should be neutral. And this really hangs up states all across the country. And that, in our view, is that government's role is not to pick winners and losers through tax policy. Government's role is to empower everyone with upward mobility and keep tax rates as low as possible and broaden tax bases. That's the key secret to good tax reform, and we've learned over the last 20 years, is broad bases, low rates, and competitive rates that make sure you're not just low for the sake of being low, but you're competitive against your competitor states. And of course, Louisiana is in a very competitive region in the Southeast. You've had to deal with the competition with Texas being a zero personal income tax state for many years. You've seen many of your young residents pick up and leave and had opportunities in Texas that they didn't have in Louisiana. You've lived that for a long time. You've seen that with Tennessee in the region, of course, with another no personal income tax state. And what we're going to talk about a little bit more detail in the region is how 2 of the other states that are your competitors, Arkansas and Mississippi, in recent years, as part of this tax cut revolution that swept the country, have taken this opportunity to become much more competitive states that are now really, you're threatened by the fact that they may bypass Louisiana very quickly when it comes to what they've done in current law that is being phased in right now in those 2 states. And of course, the final principle is predictability for businesses and for individuals. And then the most important of the principles, the first 4 are necessary but not sufficient conditions for good tax policy. What you need, of course, is a focus on pro-growth policy that will move Louisiana forward in more competitive direction. So here's a little bit more detail on this tax cut revolution across the states. We've seen 23 states substantially cut personal income taxes rates in the last 4 state legislative sessions. And that is in my 20 years of following this policy, it is a high watermark for states realizing that to compete for jobs, to keep your residents in state, you must compete through many areas of policy. Of course, this goes far broader than tax policy, but the focus today, tax policy is a key element of competing. And of course, you can fall behind by standing still, given all of the movement in the right direction. Now, one thing I know as maybe a point of discussion here going forward, but has been a major point of not just looking at the overall tax burden, but looking at the tax structure and looking at states, how they go about taxing income, for instance. And one of the big takeaways from this tax cut revolution has been states moving from a graduated personal income tax system where you have multiple tax brackets, and of course you pay a higher rate, not just pay more, but of course pay a higher rate the more you make, to more of a single rate flat tax discussion of how to tax income. And of course, this has been something, I will give you the grand totality up until the recent tax cut revolution of the states that moved from a progressive graduated income tax system to a single rate personal income tax. Going back to the first state income tax over 100 years ago in Wisconsin, basically this was the totality pre-pandemic of states that went from a graduated system to a single rate personal income tax, flat tax. And then the 2022 flat tax movement swept the states, where you had 5 states move from multiple income tax brackets down to a single rate personal income tax in that year, starting with Governor Kim Reynolds in Iowa, a state that had been not competitive within the Midwest region. Then we had Arizona next, a state that went to a 2.5% personal income tax, a flat tax, collapsing multiple brackets down to a single personal income tax at 2.5%. And to this day, the state with the lowest personal income tax of a state that has a personal income tax at 2.5%. Your neighbors in Mississippi will be phasing that down to 4% on the personal income tax side under a current law that will be phased in the next year. And then, of course, Georgia in the southeast and Idaho wrapping up this really incredible, when you think about it, 110 years and 4 states becoming single rate flat taxes, and then 5 states all in 2022. There is something really incredible sweeping the country when it comes to tax reform. Let me say, even if those that may be skeptics to the idea that lower taxes equal more growth or more inbound migration, but we're going to talk through those issues later, I do want to hit something in that for those of you that care about predictability of state finances, one of the things that we've learned in our research is the most unpredictable types of taxes are income taxes of the major types of taxes that states employ. Business taxes being the most unpredictable. As you can see, based on the last 20 years of data and broad tax collections across 50 states, we see that the corporate income tax by far is the most volatile form of taxation that states employ. Then we have the personal income tax, slightly less volatile, but the most stable piece of the tax base of the states across the 50-state perspective by far is the consumption tax or the sales tax portion of collections. And I think that can be incredibly important. And also, if for states to get it wrong, it can be incredibly detrimental. Look at California, a state that most states look at as a state that they don't want to be like, and they want to avoid the fate of California with the huge swings and boom and bust. Even you have Governor Gavin Newsom that went from a $100 billion budget surplus in recent years to now they're arguing whether the budget deficit is in the tens of billions or close to 100 billion potentially going forward, depending on whose estimate you rely on. That, of course, is because California relies so heavily on progressive forms of taxation, dividends, capital gains, and other pieces that make that tax code so volatile, which, of course, disrupts good budgeting practices and making sure that you have core government services that are delivered through state government. So when you look at some of the domestic migration trends that we see, this, folks, is a 12-month period of time that we're looking at. And this is the most recent net domestic migration numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau. And, of course, this is net domestic migration, not overall population. This takes out birth rates and death rates, and it takes out the effect of international immigration and focuses purely on Americans and where they're voting with their feet, as we like to say, across state lines. And, of course, the biggest winners in this last 12 months, Texas and Florida. Not a surprise, because these have been two of the biggest winners in the last couple of decades as we've been tracking population changes across states. Nearly 200,000 new taxpayers in both of those states in the last 12 months alone. North Carolina, which I think has been an incredible success story when it comes to long-term tax reform that's been intentional and methodical over the last decade plus. North Carolina now in the last 12 months has gained nearly another 100,000 residents. North Carolina, a state that, of course, has moved towards the flat tax. And also, I will say, on the business side of things, many people don't know this, but in current law, North Carolina's business income tax rate will go to 0 before the end of the decade. They will be the first state to eliminate a corporate income tax in recent memory. And then you can see some of the other trends here on the states that are the biggest in migration. Tennessee, of course, in the region, not a surprise, I'm sure, to anyone here, is a no-income tax state. And many of the states that I mentioned, of the states that have moved towards flat taxes or general tax reform, are now in-migration states. The states with the highest out-migration over the last 12 months alone, as I mentioned, California is probably a good example of what not to do in many cases. California is now really facing that consequence as they're becoming unaffordable for businesses and individuals. We saw the recent departure, as you saw in the news just in the last month or two, of Chevron Corporation moving from San Ramon, California, its headquarters, to Houston, Texas. One of the reasons why the CEO publicly said this move was happening was because the overall cost of business in California and the cost of even employees living in California. California down more than 330,000 residents on net in the last 12 months. New York, Illinois, New Jersey, Massachusetts. And of course, this is the unfortunate story that you all have seen really firsthand, and that is the out-migration in Louisiana picking up. Of course, over the last decade, just over 200,000 residents on net leaving Louisiana for one of the other 49 states in this net domestic migration calculation. But in the last 12 months alone, nearly 30,000 residents leaving Louisiana on net for one of the other 49 states. And to skip through a couple of these, I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the regional domestic migration piece. Now we have a situation here where nearly every state in the region has been net positive in net domestic migration in the last 12 months. Even Mississippi, which of course had been a state that had struggled mightily with many areas of economic performance and growth, has now gotten nearly to parity when it comes to net domestic migration, nearly getting to zero instead of being a much larger out-migration number in previous years. And now Louisiana, unfortunately, the outlier here, is really the only state with substantial net migration on the outbound side over the last 12 months. And of course, this is the tenure that I referenced, with Louisiana down over 200,000 residents, and Mississippi being the only other state in the region with a net negative with the outbound migration piece. Here's an interesting element of where, as of January 1st, based on current law, where Louisiana's personal income tax ranks in the region, so roughly middle of the pack in the region. But then the more concerning side is the right side of that chart, which is upon completion of current law, cuts in current law in the states in the region, where those personal income tax rates will be. Louisiana falling 2 more spots in the region. Getting back to the overall theme of falling behind by standing still is certainly the threat. You have a very aggressive governor in Arkansas with Sarah Huckabee Sanders saying as her platform that by the time that she is leaving the governor's office, she would like to see that personal income tax go to zero and eliminate that personal income tax altogether. And they've already started taking moves. As you can see, under current law, Arkansas will be under 4% in the personal income tax rate here in the completion of the cuts. And talking to some of our ALEC members in Arkansas, I mean, one of the reasons how they've been able to do this, of course, is using surplus dollars to buy down rates, which is a key element of why we've seen so many states able to cut taxes in recent years. But the other element of this is their most recent budget for their fiscal year kept spending growth below 2%. Which has been something that has been a key element of the success of so many of the tax reform packages like North Carolina and others that we've talked about, as they've matched good spending policy with good tax policy. And then, of course, you have Mississippi also leapfrogging Louisiana here with that last tranche of their flat tax going down to the 4% range. And you can see just visually here of the 3 states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, that I think are the other states, are the growth states in the region because of the income tax changes, or the states, I should say, that have made the biggest changes on income taxes in the region, going from the broad rates in 2020 in the pandemic year all the way down to where the phase-ins fully materialize in Arkansas and in Mississippi. You can see a dramatic reduction in rates. And of course, Louisiana has seen the reduction with the change in federal deductibility and the lowering of the personal income tax rate as well. Still not keeping pace, though, with those other 2 states, given the current law and the tax reform in those cases. And so with that, I know I wanted to save some time, Leader Wright, for questions and members of the committee. But what we're seeing across the country in my 20 years of traveling the 50 states has been unprecedented in terms of states taking this potentially once-in-a-generation opportunity to cut taxes, make themselves more competitive. And of course, one of the reasons why they're doing that is growing jobs in their state versus states across the country, keeping their homegrown residents. We take a lot of pride. States across the country take a lot of pride in having good education systems and having great institutions of higher learning. And then what good does it do a state if you have those great education systems and great institutions of higher learning if you're educating the workforce of Texas and Florida and Tennessee? And of course, that's been the story for many, many years. My personal story, being a Michigan native, being from a city that Saginaw, Michigan, that went from about 100,000 population a generation or two ago now to under 50,000 in population. I've seen this firsthand and what that means to communities. You've seen it in communities around the state of Louisiana as well in terms of what that outbound migration and loss of job opportunity does, loss of economic opportunity does to the fabric of a community, does to the fabric of a state. And one of the things I just implore members as you're thinking about this as well, one often forgotten element is way beyond what tax cuts mean for economic growth, what they mean for migration, what they mean for budget stability, which are all essential and important elements of getting tax reform and budget reform right. One thing that's often forgotten is the element of the human side of this and what it means for communities, what it means for charities in the states that are affected. And one really interesting and I think devastating story for Illinois, one of the big states with out-migration and high taxes I'll leave you with, is one of its wealthiest residents in recent years, Ken Griffin, who's the head of a hedge fund, Citadel, moved his hedge fund from Chicago to Miami recently, one of the many outbound moves outside leaving Illinois and going to a lower tax state. One of the things that gets forgotten that I just happened to read about in Crane, Chicago recently, that Mr. Griffin, when he left Chicago and moved to Florida and became a Florida resident, took advantage of the no income tax status, one of the things was what happened to his charitable contributions to his church or synagogue or to the Boys and Girls Club or the YMCA. It turns out that, as the news report indicates, all of his charitable contributions, about $300 million in the last year since he moved, did not go to Chicago. They went to Florida-based charities. And so what that means, of course, is something that doesn't get talked about enough, but it means those communities that are outbound migration, that are losing revenue, that are losing jobs, are also losing some of the pillars of their community when they don't get tax policy right. And that not only do they lose that revenue from those pillars, they lose their support for some of those civic institutions that, of course, are key in keeping communities healthy across the country. So thank you for the opportunity to be in front of you today. You've got an incredible opportunity to make Louisiana more competitive going forward. And as states have realized across the country, this is the time to look at that because what we've seen in the last 2 decades, this is historic what we're seeing across the country. And of course, the risk is you fall behind by standing still. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We're going to go to questions in a moment, but I just want to put a fine point on the last thing you mentioned about the human element of it. I think anybody that's lived here for a significant period of time has, become accustomed to hearing about residents in Houston. And there's, sometimes there's a joke, there's probably a couple million people there who have moved from Louisiana. I mean, you drive around, you see LSU plates on Texas, Texas plates with LSU Tigers on it. You see like all kinds of games. And the point just being is that there's very few people that I know that don't have a child with a grandchild, a daughter up in Nashville or something like that. We just see that migration is not just about jobs. It's not just about growth. It's about not being around people. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm sure some children, I did it myself for a while, want to go adventure and check, other parts of the country out, live there for a while. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But there's a cost to it, too, that really hits people. So with that, let me start with Representative Eccles. Do I have it right? Is it? You got it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate you being here today and bringing us some oversight and information from other states. I want to talk about the long-term process of this. We were talking about a tax revolution in Louisiana, which we all, I think, can agree needs to happen. We can't continue without migration. We can't continue to foster a poverty culture. We have to work towards a more industrialized manufacturing, business-based culture and state to grow the state. But with that, you've referenced North Carolina, you referenced Arizona. Talk to me a little bit about the on-ramp for that evolution. I've got friends in the North Carolina legislature, and it's my understanding, you mentioned the word 10 years that kind of define their process. How did they on-ramp this policy change set? What were the first things that they did? And is there a careful way to do this to where you don't blow up your state budget in 6 months, or even existing project sets or things that might be in consideration with old tax policy?
Well, it's a great question, Representative, and it's one that we were very involved with when this kicked off in Raleigh back 10 plus years ago. And of course, to set the context, you had a scenario where, and this is a new version of leadership coming into Raleigh. You had Speaker Tom Tillis, who's now U.S. Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina, becoming Speaker. The opposing party had been in charge of North Carolina for decades, really, before that, and they felt as a new majority, they had the mandate to come in as a Republican majority to say, let's look under the hood and see what's there in the tax code. And what they found was not satisfactory. What they found was a tax code that was littered with loopholes, a tax code that kept tax rates artificially high while really producing a scenario where there were winners and losers because of the tax exemptions, tax preferences, tax credits. And so what they set out to do was have a holistic view of how North Carolina stacked up versus the other states. And one of the metrics of that was our rich states, poor states rankings, where North Carolina, I believe at the time, was under half of the, it was in the bottom half of economic competitiveness. I think North Carolina was in the 25 or 26 ranking for economic outlook in rich states, poor states. And they said, as a state that has so many positive attributes, like Louisiana, so many positive attributes in terms of the people, in terms of geography, in terms of ports, in terms of lots of positive things, it's unacceptable that North Carolina was middle of the pack. They thought there was a real pathway to the top 20, if not the top 10. And of course, telling the last part of the story a little bit out of order, where they're at today is number 4 in economic outlook because of what they've done over the last decade. So what they did, of course, was balance the need to broaden the tax base and look for areas, let's say, that maybe other states were taxing in the sales tax base that North Carolina wasn't taxing. Businesses that were already complying with the sales tax, for instance, remitting sales tax based on goods that were not remitting that same sales tax on services, looking at those kind of opportunities that would broaden the sales tax base without creating brand new obligations for small businesses. That was a key element, I remember. But then looking at ways that the state really stuck out in an unfavorable way, where North Carolina at the time still had a state-level death tax, an inheritance tax, where we've seen states before that get rid of that, and drawing some parallels to Louisiana right now, where one of 3 states in the country to have inventory, of franchise, and a corporate income tax. I mean, where do you stack up unfavorably on even some of those areas of taxation that don't bring the largest areas of revenue? Most of course, the discussion today has so far been on the personal income tax side, which is a major driver of revenue here. But where on even some of the areas of competitiveness inducing policies, or in this case, anti-competitiveness inducing policies, where do you stick out? And that's one of the points of discussion there in North Carolina. But as part of that discussion over the last 10 years, really from the very start, it has been balancing sound spending policies to make sure that the legislature does not overdo it when it comes to spending growth, and then balancing that with tax cuts. And one of the great things that they've seen in North Carolina over time is, because of the tax cuts and as inbound migration is grown over time, they've been able to actually prioritize more and spend more in some areas of government because they have more taxpayers coming into their states. One of, I think, the heroes of federal tax reform in the Reagan era, of Congressman Jack Kemp, I think said it right. I mean, the key to raising long-term revenue for your state is not by raising tax rates, but by increasing the amount of taxpayers in your state. And that's, I think, the essential lesson of North Carolina.
Well, I guess one of the things that I've learned, Representative Sane is a good friend of mine, and they have an extra $1 or $2 billion every year to spend because of that and that innovation in their policy. Talk more about the on-ramp, though. They took 10 years to get there. With the fundamental things that they changed first, the big things, the little things, or is it just a little bit of everything all at once?
Well, that's an important point is, it's the phase-ins. I think there in North Carolina did that on a calendar basis instead of other kind of triggers that we've seen in other states based on hitting some sort of a revenue or overall economic output number. North Carolina put it in current law that they would be reducing rates on a schedule going forward and not doing it all in year one. I mean, it's important to keep this in a way that is feasible to continue going forward, not just with the spending pairing of spending responsibility with tax cuts, but by continuing to use surplus dollars over time as you see in migration, you see economic growth to buy down those rates further. The element was they wanted to get towards the flat tax. And of course, right now, as I mentioned in current law, they're getting to a zero corporate income tax altogether. But they didn't do that all in one bite from the very first piece. I think they were very methodical how they thought through this. They said this is going to be a multi-year, if not a decade-long process. And in their case, from their perspective, as Republicans taking the majority, and when they took the majority with Speaker Tillis, they had nearly 100 years of things that they thought they needed to start to tackle, and they didn't do it all in year one, but they made a very clear down payment in reducing rates, and then made that commitment to say rates will continue to go down as we have the ability to cut rates going forward.
So for business climate and growing and attracting jobs, by having that runway, if you will, were businesses still inclined to look and see what they were doing and still be encouraged to come today versus knowing that that policy may not be on the books for another 24, 36 months? Did they still grow jobs in that process?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's a key element of both on the positive and potentially the negative side is, as I mentioned, one of the key principles of tax policy that we see is predictability. And they want to know not just what tax rates are currently, but what tax rates are going to be, 2 to 3 to 5 years in the future. Because when you make $1 million or $1 billion investment and have a major company making that type of investment in your state and your people, they want to know that that rug's not going to be yanked out under them in the future. But then they also look at what is that telegraph future of current law, of what are the phase-ins, and also what is the promise really coming from policymakers, leadership, and what's the vision long term. And I think casting that vision to say, well, we're going to get done what we can with the current budget parameters right now, and we're going to keep going down this path of making our state the most competitive. And of course, in North Carolina's case, they've been very successful at doing that.
And I guess that's the comparison of the current policy proposals that we have now, and then do we have runway to get there, or are we just cutting everything off and starting tomorrow? How do you balance that and ensure that your business climate is not going to go into shock and to transfer to the next round of policies? Okay, thank you for your time.
Mr. Williams, real quick before I go back to questions, I think this is 2023. I don't recall if there's a 2024 yet. I'm sure there is. It comes early in the year, right?
Yes.
So staff had asked about how they could get copies of this. And I thought I had others, but at some point, maybe after you return, if we can get some copies on this, or if there's something online they can read, that would be great too, just to try to understand it.
Yes, I point everybody to richstatespoorstates.org, which has the most recent rankings. And also it allows, I think, kind of a unique tool to allow not just us to rerun numbers based on various ideas that you may have as part of this process unfolds, but it allows you to go through and analyze what a potential tax cut or tax increase or change in tax policy would do to your Rich States, Poor States ranking from richstatespoorstates.org. So it's a way that really allows anybody with the proposals or constituents or members of the public to say, how could we make Louisiana a top 10 state, and what would it take to get there based on our 15 criteria that we look at?
Awesome. I didn't know that. That's good to know. Thank you. Okay, Representative Galley. Wait, sorry. These new machines, I'm still not used to it. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Williams, for being here. Just to drill down a little further on what my fellow member, Rep. Eccles, was talking about, there's got to be 2 or 3 critical elements to getting on the on-ramp and then achieving the end goal of a more favorable tax code to attract business and to keep people here in the state. You mentioned a couple of things that piqued my interest. One was buying down the rate. Would you say that's one of the critical elements of creating that? And then the other one, if you would speak to, is the consumption tax. How do we massage that? How do we put a consumption tax in place that's really going to get us to where we want to be?
Yes, I think to the first point, Representative, is the rate is key. There's lots of ways that states compete with each other. Collections and burdens are an important element of that in terms of overall piece. But when you look at the incentive, right, and this is what Dr. Laffer, my co-author, of course, is famous for with the Laffer curve, and which is his work in economics, is marginal tax rates drive the incentives or disincentives in the case of high tax rates for someone to work and save and invest in one state versus another. And of course, as people are now more mobile, as we know, than ever, this is an important element as we've tracked this net domestic migration piece really over the last 20 years, is coming out of the pandemic. Employers rightly are giving employees flexibility to work, in many cases, depending on the form of business, so wherever they'd like in the United States. So driving this migration piece is really key, and marginal tax rates are a large really factor for not just businesses, but individuals of where they locate and where they'd like to work from. But one element of that, too, on the on-ramp piece is small business, an element that sometimes tax reform and tax cuts get demonized as being heavily weighted for millionaires or billionaires. I mean, we heard that criticism with the federal tax reform, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which I should mention a little bit more on that in a moment. But one of the pieces of that was when you get tax reform right, in case of TCJA, actually we had wealthy individuals in that case pay more of the total tax burden than before Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I thought that was a very interesting element that sometimes the media forgets to talk about. But one other interesting element of both federal and state tax reform as it comes to the personal income tax is the vast majority of small businesses, the mom and pops that are keeping Main Street, are fighting to keep Main Street afloat in many of the communities across the country. The vast majority of those small businesses pay on the individual side of the income tax code. Right? That's true in states and the federal side, of course. And that's such a key piece that North Carolina focused on to start early, and that's why they focused on the personal income tax as well as the business income tax going forward. And then, sorry, Representative, remind me the second piece.
The consumption tax.
Yeah, the consumption tax, of course, is the balancing act of, in the case of North Carolina, broadening the base of the consumption tax as part of this tax reform, as part of the fuel to keep the balanced budget element intact. And I will say, from our perspective, it's just as important to keep things budget neutral as it is to keep things revenue neutral. So while it's important to broaden tax bases as you lower rates, really where I started today, I think is essential when you talk about how do you balance good spending policy with good tax policy. And of course, that was one of the key takeaways from North Carolina, not just that they broadened this consumption tax base and you had more of a stable base to draw from that allowed income tax rates to continue to go down in this last 10 years, but you kept a natural spending control. There's a lot of discussion about some states like Colorado, for instance, where I think it's really interesting from a bipartisan element of talking about tax cuts that you have a Democrat governor, Jared Polis, in Colorado, who I had the honor of introducing a few weeks ago at our conference in Denver, calling for the elimination of the Colorado personal income tax for economic development reasons. I think that's a really key element of this debate going forward, that it's a bipartisan movement now that we're seeing across the country.
I apologize if it wasn't clear. What I wanted to talk about was with the surplus dollars buying down some of the debt. Is that what you were referring to when you said using the surplus to buy down rates?
Oh, during in North Carolina?
Yes.
Is using the surplus that they had coming in to buy down personal income tax rates as part of that tax reform package.
Okay. And then you mentioned spending and taxing. You can't do one without the other. Is that a fair statement?
Totally agree.
Okay.
I think that's an important statement. And what has happened in Colorado, for instance, one of the reasons I brought up Governor Polis there is Colorado, let's say in current law, in their constitution, in fact, for the last 30 years, have had something called the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, or TABOR, something that voters just had a chance to vote on in this last election, and by a 20-point margin, voted to retain that spending limit in the state's constitution, which does not allow government to grow spending faster than the combined rate of population plus inflation growth. And it has elements that allow government to grow faster than that if an emergency were to come up, let's say, and it creates a rainy day fund and lots of protections. But it's been something in Colorado that has kept spending limited and has allowed Colorado to reduce tax rates, become a flat tax state, as you saw on the slide, and then having a Democrat governor and Governor Polis now call for the complete elimination of the personal income tax. It's my contention that wouldn't be in the realm of possibility if it wouldn't have been for a long-term commitment, in their case, in the Constitution, to restrain the growth of government spending.
So you have to have both those elements. If you're going to do this properly, right, you can't just focus on revenue without looking at the other side of the ledger.
Yes, long term, it needs to be a huge part of the discussion. I mean, there in some cases that we've seen in this last 4 sessions that I've talked about the tax cutting revolution, states were able to use surplus money and able to cut taxes without going into the spending side. But long term, if you want to be, let's say, a top 10 state or have the idea of getting to a 0% personal income tax scenario like Sarah Huckabee Sanders in Arkansas or Governor Polis there in Colorado, to get to that extra level of getting the income tax eliminated, it absolutely has to be combined with good, solid spending policy.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Baham?
And I appreciate you being here today to share with us all of this information about what goes on in the other states. Obviously, Louisiana is unique in a lot of ways. When you bring up some of those states, and I've visited all of them, one of the things that I associate with the North Carolinas, the Texases, the Floridas, and so forth, is that they have good infrastructure, particularly roads. Texas has a wonderful road system. Now, the way they handle their roads is a little different. They do a lot of toll roads. Second is the quality of education, something that, unfortunately, we're not where we need to be. And a third is a sound and predictable tax policy, which Louisiana has been kind of like a fire hose. And due to the changes in administrations we've had over the years, going from Democrat to Republican, back to Democrat to Republican, things have been a little bit unstable in that. Though you cite some of these states like Colorado governed by Democrats. In Washington State, I believe Governor Inslee, I don't know if he was the governor at the time when some of these reforms happened, or if it was a different governor, a fairly left-wing guy, but they have a very healthy business client in Washington State, and they have an abundance of revenue. Now, part of that's due to the fact that that's one of the centers of the tech industry, the computer industry, and so forth. My question is this. One of my biggest concerns is I want us to avoid a legislative-made crisis in the name of reform in terms of the budget. That doesn't help anyone, and I think that has contributed to the political instability we've had between shifting administrations over the last few decades and has played out in terms of policy. Of the reforms, tax reforms out there, and I believe it needs to be done incremental, not all at one time, because we don't have the capacity. The time to have done the sweeping changes, in my opinion, was a few years ago. Now, unfortunately, our timing hasn't worked out with just the politics and the money. What would you say is the biggest priority of all of the tax reforms we could do in Louisiana?
Well, that's a great big question, and it's one that's important going forward. Obviously, is I think you need to look at one is where does Louisiana rank and be an outlier status, right? As we talked about, Louisiana being one of the only 3 states with inventory franchise and corporate income tax. That is one that certainly sticks out to me as an outside observer following this in the 50 states. But then, of course, the other piece of this is why is it that states have focused so much on personal personal income tax as a driver of migration, competitiveness, economic growth, and small business development, and really focusing bang for the buck. I mean, if you look at all taxes matter for economic growth. When you take a dollar out of the productive private sector and put it into the government sector, it's not going to be as productive as it is in the private sector. But not all tax cuts are created equally. Taxes on capital are the most damaging dollar for dollar of any tax that's out there of the major state level taxes. That's been not just based on our research, that's our friends at the Tax Foundation, that's research at the OECD, that's others across the world. Taxes on capital are the most damaging. And so focusing on streamlining to make a flat tax here, I think is a phenomenal idea to get the rate down as low as possible to compete with your neighboring states. Obviously realizing you're not going to be able to get it all in day one to compete with Tennessee and Texas and Florida in the region at zero. Competing with zero is a very difficult thing, but at least looking, as we outlined under current law there, where Arkansas and Mississippi plan to go over the next year or two, keeping pace at least, I think, with those states in focusing on the capital-based taxes. I think that's the best advice based on our research and analysis across the 50 states that we could give you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Any other committee members have any other additional questions? Just one or two more things. As we go through this process, have you by chance read any of the tax proposals that the administration has put out there?
I've just seen a little bit in the news, haven't read them in detail.
Any of those that you think might be a challenge short term, or anything that we should be adding into that bucket that's not quite there yet?
I mean, I think directionally, it's a very healthy discussion to how to grow jobs in Louisiana, how to make Louisiana more competitive, and focusing on many of those capital-based taxes that I was just talking about, such as the personal income tax, and what that could mean for small business job creation, what that could mean for domestic migration, stopping that out-migration trend, bringing in migration to Louisiana. I think a lot of those ideas are very positive, and based on what we've seen successful in North Carolina, Indiana, et cetera, that don't look to, let's say, necessarily need to eliminate on day one, but look at that long-term approach, that careful approach. I think that's what I read in the news reports, I think was very positive. And I think as we've talked about multiple times here this morning, just matching that with positive pro-taxpayer spending policy that balances the need to keep Louisiana more competitive, make Louisiana more competitive, and balancing that with the spending side of the equation.
One thing short term I have not seen is pushing harder on this sales tax centralization effort. Louisiana is obviously an anomaly there. How do you think that impacts our state, and then to be competitive with the rest of the nation from a retailer sales tax perspective? How quickly should we move on that issue?
Well, it's been a discussion in many years that I've been out here in the past, and it gets back to the earlier question, I think, of looking for those outlier areas of what makes not just the tax rates, but what are the type of taxes, what are the tax administration type decisions that have been made here in Louisiana, rightly or wrongly in the past, that make Louisiana outlier. And of course, when you're talking to businesses of looking to invest state over state, they do compare rates, they look at incentives, of course, they look at all the different things, workforce issues, as we know, not just taxes. But one of the things that I often hear from site selectors and businesses that are looking at multiple states for opportunities is, what are those things that we don't have to comply with in other states that we would be needing to comply with in a state? Potentially something like this is something I think that raises to that level. I can tell you, being a Michigan native, we had this issue in spades where we didn't have a traditional corporate income tax, and we had a gross receipts tax. I think something very dangerous, and it was something as businesses look to say, hey, we'd rather have a corporate income tax that we're used to dealing with across most states than having to deal with something unique that would require a whole lot more compliance from their perspective and cost from a business perspective. So I think that would see it with that lens of anything that has you stick out outside of the other states as a norm.
I guess as you look at national issues and looking at the perimeter of Louisiana between Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi, do you think we've lost good jobs because of that? People saying just outside of our state in order to avoid the chaotic system that we have on the books?
I think it's fair to say. I think it's fair to say that it's not just the tax rates and the tax burden, which is, and in some of the areas, Louisiana is not necessarily a high tax state in property and some of those other areas. However, when you look at the anomalies of the business tax elements, of the tax administration elements, and then some of the unique other facets of policy, I think that does have an effect on outmigration and job loss.
Thank you. Lastly, Louisiana versus Texas and Florida and Tennessee. Are there key attributes? Do you think we'll ever be a Texas or a Florida?
I think there's a lot of ways to analyze that, right? From a tax policy perspective, I think you absolutely could be a zero income tax state. It's going to take commitment. It's going to take spending discipline. It's going to take broadening the tax base in other areas to remove loopholes and to have a fairer tax base. But I think you can get there as any state can get there. One of the keys that I haven't had a chance to really go through that I'll leave you with is when you look at the 9 states without personal income taxes on wage income versus the 41 states that have taxes on wage income, you look at the overall per capita spending levels. And this is kind of getting back to my original point here. The states without personal income taxes average between 45 and 55% lower spending per capita than the states with income taxes. So it's not that they are raising tons of other tax revenue necessarily on high sales tax or high property taxes to get there. Texas case, they obviously have high property taxes, but the key to the success of how you could get to a 0% tax rate is watching that spending and emulating those spending decisions, which have powered them to become these powerhouse states when it comes to tax policy and 0% income tax.
Rep. Galley has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Just real quickly, I want to make sure I'm clear. So it's not just the tax rate, the tax burden on the personal side, but the ease in basically doing your taxes as a corporation. Is that basically what you're saying?
That's right.
So you can have a pretty good personal tax rate, tax burden not that high, but if it's difficult for a business to do their taxes at the end of the day, that could be a work against any business who wants to set up shop here. You mentioned site selection, so that's one of the factors that they're going to look at, not just personal income tax and those other variables, but how easy is it to do business based on the tax code.
That's right, and they're looking for a fair business environment, right? That it keeps things from an administration perspective simple, and also doesn't make them jump through a ton of hoops. I mean, it's a much better plan that North Carolina is, for instance, going to with the 0% corporate income tax altogether. That allows them not to have to go down the incentives route as much, or to pick winners and losers through the tax code.
Do you have an opinion on where we are in that great landscape of difficulty in doing business here when it comes to taxes?
Just from a discussion perspective with some of those site selectors and reading some of the research, I think Louisiana has a whole lot of room for improvement when it comes to perception, at the very least, if not reality, when it comes to that piece of things.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Representative Galley. We have no other questions on the board, so I'll just a quick little wrap up. Really appreciate you coming in and sharing this with us. I think, as I mentioned before, I've read it every year since I've been in the legislature, and I appreciate it. And certainly getting the color commentary as you gave us, appreciate it. So thanks for traveling down here to do this, and I'm sure we'll see you down the road. So safe travels home.
Thank you, Leader Wright. Thank you, members, and good luck on this really important journey that you have ahead of you to make Louisiana more competitive.
Thank you.